So, something unusual just happened in public view, and the way it unfolded matters more than the announcement itself. Early in the morning, Donald Trump opened Truth Social and posted a message, not a tariff warning, not a negotiation signal, a ban, 47 words saying the United States would suspend all non essential trade and travel with Canada within 72 hours unless Canada immediately accepted a framework agreement. That's $2 billion in daily commerce. Millions of American jobs tied directly or indirectly to that relationship. Decades of economic systems layered together through wars, recessions, even a global pandemic. And suddenly, the message appears on social media with a countdown clock attached. Now, here's where the moment turns. Mark Carney was already standing at a podium in Ottawa when the post appeared. Cameras were live. Journalists were in the room. A reporter read the tweet aloud while the broadcast was still rolling. There wasn't a break, no pause, no one stepping in with notes. Just a prime minister hearing in real time that the president of the United States had apparently banned his country. And in the next minute, what he said changed the entire trajectory of the story because the markets reacted almost immediately. Within about 40 minutes, the dollar weakened, gold climbed, and finance officials across the G7 were calling Ottawa. Even a Republican committee chairman in the Senate publicly questioned whether the president actually had the authority to do what had just been announced. That's why this isn't just a trade dispute. It's something more structural unfolding in the open. When a G7 leader calmly explains on live television that a presidential tweet carries no legal standing under domestic law, treaty law, or World Trade Organization rules, and financial markets start behaving as if that analysis is correct, then the credibility structure around executive power enters territory it hasn't really occupied before. And if you're watching how governments, markets, and institutions respond to signals like that, you realize this moment might define what comes next. So, what exactly triggered it? On March 25th, 2026, at 9:03 in the morning Eastern Time, Trump posted the statement. Canada, he wrote, had been ripping off the United States for years. Enough was enough. The message declared a complete ban on non essential trade and travel unless Canada signed a framework agreement immediately. 47 words. No statute cited, no emergency declaration attached, no consultation with the Office of the United States Trade Representative, no briefing for the Senate Finance Committee or the House Ways and Means Committee, both of which hold explicit constitutional authority over trade. And apparently no formal diplomatic notice delivered to Canada either. Just a social media post claiming to suspend the largest bilateral trading relationship on Earth. That relationship has survived everything. World War II, Korea, Vietnam, September 11th, the financial crisis of 2008. Even the pandemic that shut down entire global economies never interrupted US-Canada trade completely. Yet suddenly, a Tuesday Morning Post was supposed to accomplish what none of those events ever did. And when you step back for a second, you start to understand why the response mattered so much. Because Canada isn't just another partner in a trade dispute. Canada supplies the majority of American crude imports. It provides natural gas heating for millions of homes across the Northeast and Midwest. Hydroelectric power flows from Canadian systems into states like New York, Vermont, Maine, and Minnesota under long-term agreements. It's also the largest export market for American goods. The framework agreement mentioned in the Post reportedly required Canada to accept American regulatory standards across numerous industries, abandon ongoing trade disputes, and effectively surrender independent monetary policy. In other words, not a negotiation so much as a demand for surrender presented through commercial language. And when that demand gets read out loud during a live press conference, the person standing at the podium has to decide very quickly how to answer it. But the real background to this moment had been building for weeks. Tariffs escalating, energy policy disputes, agriculture disagreements, legal challenges filed under the USMCA system, each step layering a formal record of treaty disputes that Canadian officials were already documenting internally. The immediate spark came a few days earlier, on March 22nd, when Canada's challenge to American auto tariffs was accepted for expedited review by a USMCA dispute panel. Suddenly, the United States wasn't just arguing politically, it was a respondent in a legal proceeding running on its own timeline. According to reporting from several outlets, the acceptance notice landed inside the White House counsel's office and triggered an intense internal reaction. 3 days later, the tweet appeared. Sources described the ban announcement less as a carefully designed escalation and more as a reactive move, an attempt to apply the largest available pressure tool after previous ones hadn't produced compliance. But that assumption collided with the scene in Ottawa, because at 9:03 in the morning, Mark Carney was in the middle of a press conference about Canadian housing policy. Cameras from Canadian networks, international broadcasters, and global wire services were already live. A reporter raised her hand. She read the tweet into the room. The entire press theater went silent, and Carney had about 4 seconds to decide how to respond. He didn't look down at notes. He didn't ask for a printed copy. He took a breath and spoke with the kind of calm tone people develop after years managing financial crises in public, when every word is also a signal to markets. "I've seen it," he said. Then he paused, and he added something that would ripple through financial systems within minutes. "A tweet is not a law. It is..." He explained that a social media post does not constitute a legal instrument under American law, international treaty law, or the rules of the World Trade Organization. Canada, he said, would respond only to formal diplomatic instruments transmitted through proper channels, if one existed. If none existed, there was nothing to respond to. Another reporter immediately asked whether that meant Canada was ignoring the President of the United States. Carney turned toward her and answered without hesitation. "Canada," he said, "applies the same standard to American communications that it applies to every other sovereign government. If a message arrives as a formal legal instrument, Canada responds formally. If it arrives as a social media post without legal standing, Canada notes it and continues governing." And then he added quietly that Canada was continuing to govern that day. That exchange was broadcast everywhere. And the reaction in the 40 minutes that followed had almost no modern precedent in allied government relations. Currencies moved, gold climbed, Treasury yields shifted, not because of Canada's words alone, but because of the combination of two signals arriving simultaneously, one from a president announcing sweeping action through social media, the other from a prime minister explaining why that action had no immediate legal mechanism behind it. Professional traders don't wait for commentary in situations like that. They price the gap. And that's exactly what happened. And once that exchange was circulating on financial terminals, the ripple effect moved fast. Within roughly 40 minutes, finance ministers from Germany, France, and Japan had already reached out to Ottawa. According to diplomatic sources familiar with those conversations, the message was consistent. Canada had the stronger legal position, and the procedural route it had been building through USMCA dispute mechanisms was the appropriate path forward. The reaction didn't stop there. Within the hour, Britain's Foreign Secretary released a statement describing the situation as deeply concerning, while reaffirming support for the rules-based international trading system. The European Union's Trade Commissioner quickly organized a coordination call with counterparts from Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. That detail matters because those countries aren't adversaries organizing against the United States. They're longstanding allies coordinating responses to an American executive action before lunchtime on the day it was announced. And at the center of all of it sits a fairly simple legal reality. A presidential social media post has no legal effect on its own. That isn't a partisan claim or a political opinion. It's a constitutional fact. A tweet is not an executive order. It's not a proclamation. It's not a declaration of national emergency. And it's not a formal diplomatic communication between governments. Under American law, restrictions on trade at the scale described in that message require a formal presidential action tied to specific statutory authority or legislation passed by Congress. Those statutes exist, but each of them comes with procedural steps that limit how quickly and how broadly the executive branch can act. Take the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. For that law to apply, the president must declare a national emergency and identify a foreign threat affecting national security, foreign policy, or the American economy. Now, imagine the implications of formally declaring Canada a NATO ally, a NORAD partner, a Five Eyes intelligence partner, as a national security threat. The legal determination alone would be extraordinarily aggressive. Constitutional scholars say a step like that would almost certainly face immediate challenge in federal court and likely trigger an injunction before implementation even began. Another path sometimes used in trade disputes is Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. That authority has been invoked before in national security tariffs on steel and aluminum, but extending that mechanism to justify a comprehensive ban on trade with Canada would multiply existing legal challenges dramatically. Then there's Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which allows action against unfair trade practices. But that process requires an investigation and formal findings that can take months, not 72 hours. So when the message appeared online announcing a sweeping ban with a 3-day clock, the problem wasn't simply diplomatic. The problem was that there was no clear statutory vehicle ready to carry it out. And while that clock was ticking publicly, lawyers inside the administration were reportedly trying to figure out what legal instrument could actually match the announcement. One constitutional law scholar who spoke about the situation later that afternoon was Lawrence Tribe from Harvard Law School. In an interview with MSNBC, he explained that a trade ban announced through social media without citing statutory authority or declaring an emergency effectively has zero legal effect until it becomes a formal instrument. He also noted that the absence of such an instrument at the time of the announcement suggested either an impulsive decision or a miscalculation about how Canada would react. Tribe added that Carney's reply during that press conference was constitutionally accurate in every detail, and that markets, treating his explanation as the more reliable signal, made sense from a legal standpoint. Now, if you step back for a moment, that's the turning point. Because the story from that point forward isn't just about a tweet and a response. It's about the gap between declaration and implementation and how quickly that gap became visible to everyone watching. But the White House wasn't finished responding. At 11:47 that same morning, another post appeared on Truth Social. This time the message criticized Carney personally, calling him a smug globalist puppet, and insisted that the trade ban was absolutely legal and would be fully implemented. It also claimed Canada's economy was already collapsing and hinted at additional actions coming within 48 hours. But there was something notable about that follow-up message. It didn't include new legal details. No statutory authority was cited. No mechanism for implementation was described. In practical terms, the second message carried the same legal weight as the first, which is to say none. Markets reacted again. The dollar slipped another fraction against major currencies. Gold moved slightly higher, and by that point, the trading community wasn't even treating the posts as credible legal instruments anymore. Instead, they were treating them as political communications producing economic side effects. Those side effects, interestingly, were landing mostly on the American side of the border. Businesses with supply chains linked to Canada started calling lawyers about contingency plans. Consumers were suddenly facing the possibility of disrupted imports. And perhaps most significantly, the credibility cost of the announcement was being absorbed by the United States after a foreign leader had publicly described the policy as legally meaningless. All of that played out on international television, which places the administration in an extremely difficult position because now there are only two directions this situation can move, and neither of them is particularly comfortable. If the administration follows through by issuing a formal executive order, it has to choose a legal authority strong enough to defend in court. That choice would almost certainly trigger immediate federal challenges and possibly a judicial injunction before implementation. That means a federal judge publicly deciding whether the president's trade authority reaches as far as a full ban on commerce with Canada. For an administration whose political identity centers on strength and decisive action, the optics of a court blocking the policy would carry real consequences. But the alternative isn't simple either. If the 72-hour deadline expires and no formal instrument appears, the outcome effectively confirms what Carney said during that press conference, that the original message had no legal standing. And if that conclusion becomes widely accepted, governments around the world may start treating economic threats delivered through social media as political signals rather than sovereign policy. When that happens, deterrence changes, leverage changes, and the precedent established in that moment becomes available to every country that encounters a similar situation in the future. And once those two possibilities became clear, either a formal order that faces immediate legal challenge or a deadline that expires without action, analysts across Washington started describing the situation in a very specific way. They called it the most visible exposure of the gap between presidential declaration and legal reality in modern American trade policy. Elizabeth Goitein, who co-directs the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice and is widely recognized for her work on emergency powers law, spoke about the issue on NPR that evening. She said the administration appeared to face two outcomes that both carried consequences for executive credibility. One path involves issuing a formal action that courts would immediately examine, potentially forcing judges to publicly define the limits of presidential trade authority. The other path involves allowing the 72-hour clock to expire, demonstrating those limits without a court even needing to intervene. Around the same time, another signal appeared from Capitol Hill. The chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Mike Crapo, told reporters that Congress's constitutional authority over trade cannot be overridden by a social media announcement. He added that his committee would examine the legal basis of any formal action that followed. That moment carried its own kind of weight, because that statement came from a Republican senator speaking about a Republican president. And inside the West Wing, the officials responsible for managing relationships with Congress understand how unusual it is for a committee chairman to raise that question publicly in the middle of a developing situation. So when analysts started stepping back to evaluate what had actually happened on March 25th, they focused on three lessons that emerged almost immediately. The first lesson involved allied governments. Leaders and ministries across the international system just watched a G7 prime minister respond to a presidential economic threat by explaining calmly and in detail that the announcement carried no legal force. And within minutes, financial markets behaved as though that explanation was correct. That sequence becomes a permanent reference point for every finance ministry and trade ministry around the world. It alters how other governments model American reliability, not just for this episode, but for future ones as well. The second lesson landed closer to home. American businesses suddenly saw how wide the space can be between a presidential declaration and the legal process required to implement it. From the outside, a policy announcement can appear to take effect immediately. But constitutionally, it may still be waiting for formal instruments that haven't yet been issued. That uncertainty alone carries economic costs. Supply chain planners hesitate, investment decisions pause, Legal teams start reviewing contingency options, and those costs accumulate even if the original announcement never becomes law. The third lesson may be the most significant over the long term. Canada learned that it could confront a presidential threat publicly, characterize it accurately as having no legal standing, and come away with its international credibility strengthened rather than weakened. And once a government learns something like that, it doesn't forget it. That experience becomes part of institutional memory, not only in Ottawa, but in every allied capital that watched the exchange unfold in real time. So the next time an American administration uses economic pressure against an ally, the March 25th example already exists as a kind of playbook. The legal arguments are documented, the diplomatic coordination pattern is established, and the market reaction is now part of the historical record. Those precedents don't disappear when the news cycle moves on. But beyond the legal details and the market movements, there's another layer to the story that stretches further into the future. Because situations like this shape something less visible, but extremely important: the credibility of the system that governs international economic relations. For decades, the United States invested enormous diplomatic energy into building a rules-based trading order. Treaties, dispute panels, arbitration mechanisms, all designed to create predictable processes when disagreements occur. When those systems function smoothly, governments rely on them, markets rely on them, and allies build long-term policy decisions around them. But when signals appear that bypass those mechanisms, uncertainty spreads. And in the middle of that uncertainty, other global powers are paying attention. China, for example, didn't issue major public statements about the events of March 25th, but it didn't need to. Observers across the strategic community point out that Beijing has been working for years to build alternative economic frameworks and partnerships. When the United States appears to weaken the credibility of its own trade signals, that development naturally strengthens arguments for those alternatives. The effect doesn't require direct action. It unfolds gradually as governments and markets adjust their expectations. And that's why some analysts say the broader consequences of this moment may extend far beyond the immediate dispute between Washington and Ottawa. Because while the United States and Canada were exchanging statements on television, other allies were already coordinating discussions among themselves. The European Union, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand all participated in conversations that afternoon focused on legal and economic responses to unilateral trade pressure. Again, these aren't rival governments forming an opposing bloc. They're long-standing partners of the United States assessing how to respond when one member of the system acts outside the established process. Each of those countries has its own trade agreement with Washington. Each of them has potential exposure to similar policy announcements, and each of them now has a fresh example to analyze. So ministries in those capitals are studying the same sequence Canada studied before this confrontation reached its current stage, looking at treaty mechanisms, dispute procedures, and coordinated responses that could be activated if necessary. That kind of institutional analysis tends to have lasting effects. Once governments adjust their internal models about how another country operates, those models influence policy decisions for years afterward, which means the posture of American allies toward U.S. economic commitments may already be shifting in subtle ways. And changes like that rarely reverse overnight. They tend to evolve gradually through patterns of reliability or patterns that suggest reliability has weakened. And if you step back far enough to see the full sequence, not just the headlines, but the order of events, you start to notice something that Washington hasn't fully addressed in public yet. Because this didn't begin with one tweet, the pattern has been building through a series of escalations. First came auto tariffs. Canada answered within minutes with retaliatory measures. Then there were threats about wheat access, and Canada redirected supply toward Japan and South Korea. When energy tariffs were floated, Canada moved to declare energy independence and signed new LNG agreements with European partners. Then an export sovereignty directive appeared, and almost immediately, Canada announced that it had already secured alternative supply partnerships covering the vast majority of the affected sectors, arrangements that had reportedly been finalized days earlier. And finally, the trade ban announcement arrived. At each stage of that sequence, Canada's response arrived quickly, carried clear legal framing, and involved coordination with international partners. That pattern matters because it suggests something beyond reaction. It looks more like a strategy unfolding step by step. And so far, the measurable outcome of that strategy has been consistent. Canada has not conceded. Canada has not appeared to concede. And the broader international community has gradually aligned with Canada's procedural position as the dispute has escalated. Now, right at this moment, everything is focused on a very specific clock, 72 hours. The administration announced that deadline when the original message was posted at 9:03 in the morning on March 25th. And that means attention is now fixed on what happens when that clock reaches the same minute on March 28th. Because the situation right now looks like this. The deadline is running. Canada has declined to treat the announcement as a legal instrument and has continued operating as usual. 3 G7 finance ministers have already contacted Ottawa. Several allied governments have begun coordination discussions. Financial markets have reacted, with the dollar weakening and gold moving upward. A Republican chairman of the Senate Finance Committee has publicly questioned the legal authority behind the announcement. Businesses inside the United States that depend on Canadian supply chains have started consulting attorneys about contingency planning. And meanwhile, the USMCA dispute panel process that helped trigger this confrontation continues moving forward on its own legal timeline, completely unaffected by anything appearing on social media. So the entire situation is converging on that upcoming moment. 9:03 a.m. If a formal executive order appears before that deadline, the first thing lawyers and analysts will examine is the statutory authority cited in the document. That citation will reveal almost immediately how strong or how vulnerable the legal foundation is likely to be, because different statutes bring different procedural requirements. Some invite immediate court challenges. Others require investigations or findings that take time. Whichever path is chosen will determine how quickly federal courts become involved and how complicated the legal fight becomes. But if the deadline arrives and no formal order appears, then the story moves in another direction. In that case, the focus will shift to how the White House explains the absence of implementation. And that explanation will reveal something important. Whether the administration views the original announcement as a policy that simply hasn't been finalized yet, or whether it recognizes that the underlying legal structure was never in place to support it. Because once the clock passes without action, the central claim made during that press conference in Ottawa, that the announcement had no legal standing, becomes much harder to dispute. And if that interpretation settles into the public record, it will influence how governments, markets, and businesses evaluate future statements coming from Washington. That's the quiet part of this story, not the noise of political exchanges or the headlines of the day, but the deeper question about credibility, how it's built, how it's tested, and how quickly it can shift when legal reality and public communications start moving in different directions. Right now, the world is waiting to see which path this situation takes. And sometimes the most revealing moment in a story isn't the announcement. It's what happens when the deadline arrives.